Okay, good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Secular Society's 2018 Bradlaugh Lecture. My name is Stephen Evans. I'm the Chief Exec of the National Secular Society. It's great to be back in Manchester in the rain again for only the second Bradlaugh Lecture. The name of this lecture series is in recognition of the founder of the NSS, Charles Bradlaugh. And for those of you who don't know who he is, Bradlaugh was a leading 19th century atheist, freethinker and radical who founded the society back in 1866. Since that time, the NSS and its members have pioneered many social reforms which have in many ways transformed society. Indeed, the journalist Edward Pearce said that much of our modern mindset is Bradlaugh's creation. But Bradlaugh is probably most well known for his struggle to enter Parliament. He was refused his seat in Parliament on account of his atheism, despite being elected by the people of Northampton to represent them in 1880. As a known atheist, he was refused the oath of allegiance, which entails swearing to God, and he wasn't allowed to affirm because that right didn't extend to atheists. That right was very much reserved for Quakers at the time. The fight to take his rightful place in Parliament went on for many years. It involved him being fined numerous times, even a period of incarceration inside the clock tower of Big Ben. And it was only on his fifth election to Parliament in 1886 that he was allowed to actually finally take his seat. And it was his Oaths Act of 1888 which extended the right to atheists to affirm, which of course is a right that's enjoyed by many MPs, non-religious MPs to this day. And I'm not sure if you've seen it already, but you can find Bradlaugh hanging in the stairwell outside this room, where at least a portrait of Bradlaugh hanging. You won't actually find Bradlaugh hanging, although if some of the 19th century Christians had their way, then, well, maybe you would. But as an MP, Bradlaugh took a keen interest, a special interest, in the plight of the people of India under the rule of the British Raj. So much so, in fact, that in India, Bradlaugh was fondly regarded as the member for India. When he died in January 1891, his funeral was attended by 3,000 mourners, which included a young Mahatma Gandhi, who later, of course, went on to be assassinated by a right-wing Hindu nationalist, which rather neatly brings me on to, contrived maybe, but rather neatly brings me on to today's lecture, The Man Who Killed Gandhi. And to deliver it, we're delighted to be joined by esteemed human rights activist, author and NSS Honorary Associate Gita Sahgal. Gita is the founder of the Centre for Secular Space, a passionate and committed defender of the human rights of women and minorities, and a thorn in the side of religious fundamentalists everywhere. So I'm also proud to say a very close friend of the NSS. So I know you're going to give a very warm welcome to Gita Sahgal. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for being here on this rainy afternoon. I left England in the middle of a heat wave and spent a very exciting month in India watching events unfolding, and so it's a bit of a shock to come back suddenly to rain. I'd forgotten that it could rain in England for a few short months. Now, I'm very nervous with these things, with that, so I'm not sure I'm going to do it exactly as it should be done, but mainly I've brought pictures to look at while I talk, so I shall flip the slides every now and then. So it's a great honor and a grave responsibility to be asked to give this lecture on the religious political movement known as Hindutva. In Britain, the election in India in 1914 of the far-right party, the BJP, was accompanied by widespread rejoicing on all sides of the political spectrum. If there was one thing that united MPs across Labour and Conservative benches of our divided island, it was the spectacle of Prime Minister Modi's visit. Even though his government or organisations close to him were alleged to be implicated in the killing of 3 British men, killings which occurred in the course of a mass murder and displacement of Muslims in Gujarat in 2002, and which have been designated by some human rights groups as genocidal murders. Even though that was the case, what was at stake was too important to dim the celebrations, apart from, of course, a few killjoys. So the killjoys of the Avaz network, old friends of mine who I had worked with at the time that the Avaz network took up all kinds of religious fundamentalism, projected this image onto Parliament. It's an Om sign converting into a swastika, and Modi with a sword, which are photographs of Modi carrying a sword with a turban. So I'm particularly pleased today to give this lecture in the name of Charles Bradlaugh, who founded the secular movement in Britain. His extraordinary life is a reminder that the origins of secularism, the fight against religious privilege, was also allied to the great causes of our time. One of these was women's emancipation. Bradlaugh and Annie Besant, who later became a famous Indian nationalist, were tried for obscenity for promoting contraception. Another was Bradlaugh's challenge to the British Empire. As well as supporting Irish Home Rule, he was known as Member for India in Parliament, where with the support of early Indian nationalists, he raised the issue of unjust terms of trade with India and exposed the British government's inaction over a famine, successfully forcing relief measures to be taken. He was invited to speak to the 5th session of the Indian National Congress in 1889, and in his closing speech called for unity across the subcontinent. In this movement, he said, let there be no force save the force of brain, no secret union, let all be open, frank, and before the law. Then if mischief touch you, so far as one man may, and so far as one man's speech can, English liberty shall put itself on the side of yours. Bradlaugh died in England soon after, and a young law student named Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi attended his funeral. In a world where the very notion of secularism is rejected by imperial nostalgics on the one hand as a godless attempt to destroy Christianity and Judeo-Christian traditions, and by anti-imperial post-colonial theorists as part of an imperialist plot, or rather a Western discourse, which was mimicked by hapless natives who know no better, Bradlaugh's life and work sings to us today. So I'm extremely grateful to the National Secular Society for choosing this topic, usually ignored by think tanks on extremism and terrorism, and for their principal support for victims of every kind of religious abuse, from victims of church abuse and victims of grooming gangs, to challenging religious privilege in schools, opposing draconian counter-terror legislation which threatens our liberties, and supporting Dalit rights. The rise of far-right populist movements cannot really be understood without studying Hindutva. At the risk of sounding like something out of Goodness Gracious Me, which some of you might remember was that Indian program, British Asian comedy, in which old Indian men always claimed that India always invented everything first, I'd say that Hindu fundamentalism is one of the foundational far-right movements of the 20th century. That it has only come into its own in the 21st century is because it has always been exposed by nationalist movements which challenged empire, anti-caste movements which challenged the extreme hierarchies of Orthodox Hinduism, and a variety of rationalist, humanist, and left movements. All these movements fed strains of secularism, which enabled religion to be attacked head-on and without apology. I say religion and not simply fundamentalist religion because caste and the attempt to escape or obliterate it are the story of all religious movements in India, as well as the story of secularism. Buddhism, Jainism, anti-Brahmin movements of South India, the mystical Bhakti and Sufi movements, and many conversions to Islam and Christianity can all be read as a challenge to a Brahmanical order and an attempt to escape the straitjacket of caste. And indeed, Hindutva itself is an attempt to become a cross-caste movement, unlike traditional Hinduism. Studying Hindutva also challenges the assumption that religious fundamentalist movements can only come from monotheistic and Abrahamic religions. It is a perfect study in the postmodernist art of balancing, opposing, and apparently contradictory message with a narrow and determinist worldview. Yet, as I hope to show, the preoccupations of this movement have remained remarkably stable over a century, where India has undergone profound change, loss, recovery, and deep social reform. So I define religious fundamentalist movements as modern transnational political movements of the far right, using media and technology to advance their aim, which refer to a perfect mythical past which they are trying to reclaim for the future. A pamphlet written by Hindutva scholars against Marxist historians who are at the forefront of challenging one of the central Hindutva claims, in this case whether Ram was a historical figure or just an epic mythical figure whose birthplace could be evidenced from historical and archaeological sources. The Hindutva historians stated crossly that the hallmark of Marxist historians was not only that they want to rewrite the history, but also want to change not only the future history, but also the past history. So, pleading guilty to want to change the future, I start with the remarkable events that have taken place in India over the last few days and end at the beginning of the Hindutva view of the world, the dawn of the age of the Aryan. Many of you will be aware of the remarkable Supreme Court judgment which established that consenting same-sex relations in private were to be decriminalized. The court's eloquent judgment ruled on grounds of privacy as well as liberty and equality, on social and economic as well as political rights. Majoritarian views and popular morality cannot dictate constitutional rights, it said. It is a very wide-ranging judgment, covering the right to be a minority, the protection of privacy and individual rights, the right to equality before the law. And the court argued that the Constitution is a living document that must be interpreted in the light of the times, comprehensively dismissing an earlier judgment that had stated that small minorities do not deserve protection and that this was a matter for parliamentary reform. But this extraordinary message came at a time when some of the nationally known human rights advocates are under unprecedented attack. Two major events happened within days of each other. One was the apparent unraveling of the mystery of who had shot four well-known rationalists over a period of time. They weren't shot at the same time. Narendra Dabholkar, a Maharashtrian who had founded a grassroots rationalist movement, was killed by unknown assailants in 2013. He was followed by Gobind Pansare, a communist who had denounced Dabholkar's murder, and then Professor Kalburgi. Gauri Lankesh was the last, a journalist who was assassinated a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, in 2017. These four murders, which have remained unsolved, but a police investigation found that the murders of the four prominent rationalists were related, and that people involved in cow protection movements, which is one of the other signature movements of the Hindutva movement at the moment, had been groomed to hate by watching videos in ways that are familiar to other students of extremism. These allegations by national police forces of a wide-ranging conspiracy brought together the targeted assassinations of known individuals with the lynching by mobs of unknown people. Two separate campaigns, it appears, may be related. In what has become known as WhatsApp lynchings, the fury of crowds has been provoked by the transmission of messages on WhatsApp with allegations such as child kidnapping or illegal transportation of cows. In 2017, there have been 11 deaths and 37 hate incidents related to cows and to other things. On the left and the right, we have two people who were killed in two of these lynchings. On the right, we have Junaid, who was a 16-year-old boy who at Eid had gone to buy clothes, basically for a lovely outing with his family, his brothers, to have some fun, to pick up some perfume, some new fresh clothes and so on, and was coming back on the train. and there was an altercation. They were accused of being beef-eaters and anti-national and so on, and stabbed and thrown off the train. On the left, there's Pehlu Khan, who was beaten to death in a videoed incident. And in the middle, there's a man who beat another man to death and burnt him, and said he was doing it in the name of preventing love jihad, or women being entrapped in fake marriages and forcibly converted. But just as people had begun to digest this breakthrough, or apparent breakthrough by the police, the local police of the state of Maharashtra launched a nationwide campaign to arrest senior human rights advocates, whom they termed urban Naxals. Naxal being a word for the Marxist-Leninist movement, which is an insurgency, a very dangerous insurgency across India. But the people, some of whom came very close to home, whom we know, if we've been involved with the human rights movement, were people who defended the rights of Adivasis, of people living in the tribal areas, and Dalits. And yes, there were some revolutionary poets who write and speak about revolution, which in India is a perfectly normal thing to do, just as it's normal to speak about wanting a Hindu state, which is, of course, the goal of the Hindutva movement. But they were suddenly accused of being involved in happenings at a Dalit rally, a major rally of around 25,000 people, which had actually pledged never to vote for Modi and to defend the constitution, and which was actually led by two former judges. There had been violence at that rally, but the people who had been named in the violence had been activists of the Hindutva movement. Suddenly, these other people who were not even present at the rally were being arrested in raids that happened simultaneously all over India. To the media, the police said, because it wasn't at all clear from the charges that were brought, that the police said they were part of an anti-fascist front. That was a charge. And they also said there were plots to assassinate the prime minister and to buy high-grade weapons from one comrade Prakash for the benefit of the Naxal emergency. Now, these were treated differently by different media, because the Indian media, by and large, has become pretty toxic. And I can recall sitting in India watching Indian TV, one of the more right-wing channels, where the host, Arnab Goswami, had said, he looked directly into camera and he said, there's no way of dealing with these people other than to eliminate them. And in my view, I've never heard a clearer call for people to be killed. But there were other media that said, what's going on? And there were defense experts saying it's very unlikely that people would be writing uncoded letters. Just the facts of the case seemed odd. And then the courts became very angry, because these matters were brought immediately by other human rights defenders to the high courts and the Supreme Courts to try and prevent people being carted off to jail, and they were put under house arrest. And the Supreme Court and the Bombay High Court and various other courts said, we've got the matter in front of us, why are you giving interviews to the media? And the Supreme Court observed that there was a right to dissent, that it was a safety valve in a democracy without which the pressure cooker might blow up. So, who are the organizations representing Hindutva, or what is known as the Sangh Parivar? That's a family of organizations. The key organizations are three, which have the largest initials over there. So I think the RSS really is central. And it is a huge, perhaps one of the largest organizations anywhere in the world, with volunteer groups all over Britain, all over many other countries, right across India. It's a very strong, disciplined paramilitary organization. It was founded in the 1920s. The VHP was founded later as a more traditional Hindu organization using Hindu Swamis and others to promote various goals and campaigns, which also operates abroad. And the BJP, of course, is a political party which took power with a very convincing victory in the last elections in India. But there are dozens of other related organizations which may not be formally related, but which have links to these three main organizations, or which share, if they don't have links, a common ideology. So every Prime Minister of the BJP, a former Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who died recently and is much mourned, in fact, in India, as a very different Prime Minister from the current one, Prime Minister Modi in power. But even the relatively liberal Vajpayee, Prime Minister Modi, have cut their teeth as organizers in the RSS movement. And every BJP government, even with an absolute majority and a PM as powerful as Modi is, reports to the RSS. It is both organizer and conscience of the movement. And at the moment in India, you have the president, the vice president, the prime minister, and a number of other ministers who are all members of the RSS. I mean, that has never happened before. That is quite unprecedented. And in fact, I think as we speak, the vice president is in America at a World Hindu Congress, which seems to have strong VHP and RSS links, and is speaking over there. And there was a bit of a kerfuffle in India where they first announced it on the Foreign Affairs website and then took it off because there were a lot of questions as to why the vice president was actually attending such a major religious political event. In Britain, the RSS is known as the HSS. That is to everybody, including its own supporters internally and to other people who criticize and watch it, except, and we'll talk about this later, the Charity Commission, which hasn't sort of noticed the link. And there are many organizations which have been set up to defend particular issues with names like Hindu Awakening, protection of cows. There are also people who work on history and rewriting history, their conversion organizations and protection of the honor of women. And there are also very modern media gurus and techie support workers, trolls, and IPACs, the American model of fund collecting, who have influenced elections in various countries, certainly here and in America have been active. And their think tanks, particularly in the world of security studies, with former senior security advisors, generals, and so on. The historian Dilip Simian has talked about this. He is now a Gandhian after a long journey, including being actually an urban Naxal, and having written about it quite scathingly in a novel, Revolution Highway, but having then abjured violence and taken to organizing against communalism, as many people have in India, have been through that political journey. And he's written, the characteristic feature of modern political reality is the predominance of extremism, paradoxically not at the extremes, but in the very heart of the established order. Sentiment is evoked constantly to intimidate government and to justify hooliganism. Controlled mobs are kept in waiting to be unleashed at the appropriate moment to build and consolidate constituencies of sentiment. Private armies and militias are commonplace. He says the very distinction between lawful conduct and legitimate practices on the one hand, and unlawful conduct and illegitimate practices on the other, seems to have been lost. Leading the charge is a ruling elite comprising powerful corporate executives, high-level elected officials, and civil service officials, of whom the latter two categories are sworn to uphold the law. The established order is extremist, and terrorism is its excrescence. And it seems like strong words, but I can't describe how violent these particular sets of killings have been and how they come in after a range of other larger set-piece killings. So in the 90s, we had the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, in which British Indians were very active, Hindus were active here, raising money and getting bricks, blessed golden bricks, to be sent back to India in order to build a temple. And there was actually a film made in the early 80s by a company that I worked for in Channel 4 called Bandung File, and my friend Vasudha Joshi was part of it, where long before what happened in the 90s, which was when a mosque structure was torn down, and huge riots happened in its wake, where the VHP and the RSS and the then Home Minister Advani went on what's called a Rath Yatra, a sort of procession with a big chariot. And in the wake of this procession, there were major riots all over India, and including for days and days in Bombay, and there was curfew all over India. I remember being curfewed in Calcutta, where you don't normally expect to have riots of that kind. It normally doesn't hit it. So there was mass violence then. Then in 2002, under Modi's watch as Chief Minister in Gujarat, there was a train of the activists who were involved with the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which burnt, killing many people. There were a lot of arguments about whether the fire was deliberately set. There were definitely fights between Muslims on the platform and these activists of the Hindutva movement, and many people died. About 59 people died. And in the wake of that, there were huge killings of Muslims with very organized groups. So there were electoral registers people had. There were attacks on businesses that were not obviously Muslim businesses, where maybe one partner was Muslim in a business. There were attacks in the slums. There was attacks on the legislator was killed. It went right across class. And there were mass rapes of women at that time. And at that time, Modi had just become Chief Minister of the state. And these happened under his watch, with the police standing by and refusing to do anything about it. Now, what's interesting about that is that the first election he actually faced was after these massacres, and he came in with a good majority, and the BJP has ruled. I mean, it was already ruling Gujarat, but it has continued to rule ever since. Even though the last election it was a little bit cut down. So those large set pieces are rather different from what we're seeing as and in 2008 there were attacks on Christians, very poor Christians in the western state of Orissa, again after the killing of Holy Man, possibly by Marxist-Leninists, it's not very clear. And there were attacks on churches and very poor converts to Christianity who are still living in miserable conditions. So the lynchings that we see now, and these killings of these famous rationalists, but also many other killings of other journalists, people who are not so well known, who are provincial journalists writing for regional papers, that don't hit the headlines, are happening all the time. But it's picking off individuals rather than the major set-piece killings. So I think people do actually learn from their errors, which is to say that they change the tactic. It doesn't mean that the ideology has necessarily changed, but the tactic has. So what is the movement that brought about these various killings? One of its ancestors was in the 19th century movement called the Arya Samaj, to the Society of Aryans, which was a revivalist movement, as there were many revival movements across the world at that time, religious revival movements, that were concerned about challenging the colonial systems in the countries that they came from, and but also looking at things that were happening internal to that society. So this was a movement that was concerned both about purifying Hinduism, but also about conversions to Islam, and launched what was called the Shuddhi movement to make sure that the population of Hindus didn't decline, because it was worried about conversions. And these issues have remained preoccupations to this day. But the term Hindutva itself is a term invented less than a century ago, and is generally taken to refer to the social and political ideology which is aimed at establishing a Hindu state. Hindutva, the term was invented in 1923 by V.D. Savarkar. Savarkar was an atheist who had either inspired or committed various acts of individual terrorism, that is, assassinating British officials or inspiring others to do so, and he'd been put in jail as a result. And while he was in jail, he invented a new philosophy, calling it Hindutva. And he wrote in a pamphlet, Hindutva, What is a Hindu? He wrote, a Hindu is a person who regards the land of Bharatvarsh, the land of India, from the Indus to the seas as his fatherland as well as his holy land, and that is a cradle land of his religion. So Pitra Bhumi was fatherland and Punya Bhumi was holy land. Muslims and Christians might be born of Indian blood, and they could therefore convert back to being Hindus, but they could never really belong as Muslims and Christians because their holy lands were outside in Arabia and Palestine. Later, the image of Mother India, one that was embedded in the national consciousness, was also added, and Hindutva pulled off the quite complicated balancing act of creating a masculinized image of the nation's strong, aggressive, and recovered pride, along with a feminized image of being under assault. As he wrote, at last she was rudely awakened on the day when Muhammad of Ghazni cursed the industry and the frontier line of Sindhustan and invaded her. That day the conflict of life and death began. That day, and then he said, nothing makes the self conscious of itself so much as a conflict with the non-self. Nothing can weld peoples into a nation and nations into a state as the pressure of a common foe. Hatred separates as well as unites. Much, much later, in 2002, a feminist human rights investigation into the Gujarat massacre reported that students were asked to celebrate Independence Day as the day their mother was ripped asunder. Violent imagery of what had been done to Hindus, as well as a promotion of how they should treat others, frequently videoed, first on videos and then circulated, rape of women and so on, or on cameras is quite common. But internally, Hindutva could afford to be quite Catholic. Sikhs, Jains, atheists, reformers, and traditionalists could all belong. The pamphlet, Khaki Shorts and Saffron Flags, written by some of the hated Marxist historians, says, Savarkar soars above sectarian and ritual differences within what he has defined as the fold of Hindutva. It was intended to be a unifying movement, and much later they interviewed in the 1990s Sudarshan, Assistant General Secretary of the RSS, who described this Catholicity as many flowers, one garland, many rivers, one ocean. But he warned the country can only have one Hindu culture, so all must accept it. And all must accept Ram, if not as divine, at least as the nation's hero. And this, of course, was a break from the purifying tradition of the Arya Samaj with its supposed return to the Vedic text, which actually stripped out a lot of traditional Hindu practices of worship in temples and with idols and so on. So Hindutva manages to refer to the purifying movements that had stripped away many Hindu practices, and yet mobilized brilliantly around movements such as the building of the Ram temple, where a lot of Hindus could understand this as a devotional practice, who were bhakts of Ram, that is, devotees of Ram, and therefore, even though it was framed as in a very new way, it was something that they could relate to. and Ram as an aggressive masculine figure, as the perfect ruler. Another ideologue called Golwalkar, a man whom the Prime Minister reveres, had written very favorably. Remember, this is the 1920s and 30s, and the RSS was formed in the 20s, and they were very conscious of movements across the world. So he'd written about, he was looking across to Germany, and he said, to keep up the purity of the race and its culture, Germany shocked the world by purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Race pride at its highest has been manifested here, a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by. And then he also said, our nation means, and independent of the question of majority, always must mean the Hindu nation and naught else. Modi is a devotee of Golwalkar and defended him in a long laudatory essay, saying that he had been unfairly targeted as pro-Mussolini and Hitler. And others have also tried to dismiss it and said this is just a couple of paragraph, statement here and there, and trying to put too much emphasis on it. But an Italian historian has established that they didn't just admire from afar. Correspondents of Hindu-supporting newspapers based in London reported approvingly of Mussolini's revival of Italian fortunes and were particularly impressed by the youth movements that he founded. And one of the mentors of the RSS journeyed to Italy, which made a deep impression on him. Mussolini had turned an easygoing, non-martial Italians into a martial race. And the historian says he didn't realize how skin deep that was, but at the time, it was particularly the youth bodyguards, the youth militias and guards of the revolution that he was very keen on. And the Marathi paper Kesari reported developments in Italy from London and quite possibly had access to English language materials on fascism, such as a 1927 pamphlet titled The Recent Laws for the Defense of the State, which laid out measures such as a ban on subversive parties, limitations to the press, expulsion of disaffected persons from public posts, and finally the death sentence. And there was also a meeting with Mussolini where he pledged to continue Mussolini's methods when he returned to India. This is a man called Munje. He said, I have thought out a scheme when he came back to India, he told a newspaper, which provides for Hindu Dharm Rashtra, that is the Hindu religion, a state of the Hindu religion, standardized Hinduism. But this scheme cannot be brought about unless we have our own Swaraj, our own freedom, like Shivaji of old, Shivaji being a great hero, actually across the political spectrum, who had fought the Mughals and established his own state, or a dictator like Hitler or Mussolini. This does not mean we should sit with folded hands until the dictator arises. We should formulate a scientific scheme and carry on the propaganda for it. And they were in touch with the English, the Italian consuls and so on. At the same time, Congress leaders were also traveling to Italy and Germany, and there was one faction of the Congress that actually became much more closely involved with the Axis powers than the Hindutva group did, and formed the Indian National Army, which fought against the British out of soldiers that were prisoners of war. But other factions of the Congress were very conscious. The leader, Nehru, was very, very conscious of fascism. He visited Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War to support the Republican side. There were British socialists writing for the Congress papers. They were very, very internationally aware. And I know that when my own grandparents, Nehru's sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit and her husband Ranjit Pandit, who had studied in Germany and would have made an excellent ambassador to the British on the principle of my enemy's enemy is my friend, they avoided meeting Mussolini because they didn't want to be used for fascist propaganda. But before the war, Savarkar continued to support the Sudeten Germans' desire for unity with Germany. And after the war started, the organization, one of his organizations, the Hindu Mahasabha, continued to support German expansionism, but muted its support and negotiated instead with the British Viceroy Linlithgow for responsive cooperation. So at the war, you have at the start of the Second World War, you have the Congress saying, we want independence and we will be with you. We are with you in the fight against fascism, but we will not be made to go to war as a subject country. And they started the Quit India movement and left the provincial governments they were in and went to jail. Savarkar, who was actually supportive of Nazism and with other members of his party, stayed in what they call responsive cooperation. So it managed to maintain its fascist and increasingly its Nazi sympathies while simultaneously declaring loyalty to the empire and trying to negotiate some gains, such as more Indians in the military and running a militia and so on. In contrast, the Congress had responded to Kristallnacht with a resolution against the Nazis and for protection and asylum for Jews. So you have this extremely difficult time, and you have at that time, shortly when the war ends, you have Britain leaving, making preparations to leave, and partition coming up, which was in fact a very difficult time for all Indians, I think, at that time, because partition was opposed, and in fact most strongly opposed by Gandhi, more than other leaders of the Congress who eventually accepted it. And there were mass killings that went on both sides, across the border. Trainloads of people were killed coming one way or the other. But at that time, there was, of course, a lot of rage because this fatherland and Holy Land had been divided. And I'm not sure what the Hindutva activists wanted to do about Muslims, because they didn't think that they could be part of the Indian state as they envisaged it, but on the other hand, they didn't want a separate state. And one of the people who was particularly angry was a man called Nathuram Godse. Now, in the 80s, when I was when Bandung File, this black current affairs program, started, we did what I mentioned before, a program about this movement that was on at the time, but which we didn't know what it would become. And it was quite a prescient program. And it interviewed Gopal Godse, who was Nathuram, that's him on the left, his brother, who Nathuram Godse was hanged for the assassination of Gandhi. His brother was put on trial and served time in prison, but was later released. And he was interviewed later, and he was completely unrepentant. And he said, we had to kill Gandhi. There were 10, and we thought, what will we lose? We may lose 10 people, but it had to be done because he was a traitor. And it also interviewed was Romila Thapar, who was a historian, and talked about this movement for Ram Janmabhoomi. And one of the things about the Hindutva movement is that although it draws heavily on the epics, there isn't a willingness to see the epics simply a story. Because in a world where you have to be both scientific and rational, as well as have a transcendental vision, there has to be a substance to the epic, and therefore it has to be grounded in a particular place, at a particular time, a particular location. In fact, to create a sort of Mecca, which is very unlike traditional Hinduism, where the central place was supposed to be the birthplace of Ram, so a mosque that had been built on top of it was to be brought down, and this temple building exercise in which Hindus all over the world were sending bricks to it and had mobilized around it, that would happen. So that's what the program was about. But it was also about what was happening here in Britain, because the RSS and the VHP, the RSS being called the HSS, had been funded by local councils as cultural organizations. And there was actually an Asian, a Hindu councillor, who said, these people are fascist organizations, we do not understand why the GLC and others were funding them. And just to jump ahead in my story, Ken Livingstone was interviewed, and he said, oh, we didn't know they were fascists, we knew nothing about it, because what do we know, we just do, you know, what's recommended, and we wouldn't do it. But as we know from Ken Livingstone's story, that kind of funding, there's been much more emphasis on Muslim groups, extremist Muslim groups being funded, which indeed there are and continue to be. But there is this tradition of putting money into some of these groups as well. So at that time in the 80s, we in Britain were trying to grapple both with the movement that was happening in India and this revival of the idea of God's sake. But when the BJP came to power this time around, Godse was announced as a major hero. And people wanted to, and you can see he's very respectfully treated there with the gardens and so on. And he was supposed to be put, people wanted to build a statue to him and so on. And they saw him as having dealt with the traitor Gandhi. And on the right you can see a portrait of Savarkar with senior BJP leaders very respectfully bowing before it. And that portrait was put up of Savarkar in the previous BJP administration, which sort of hangs in the Hall of Heroes opposite Gandhi. Now Savarkar, who had founded the RSS, the idea of Hindutva and was involved with the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, he had also been charged with the in the plot to assassinate Gandhi, and he stood trial for that, but was eventually acquitted. And it's extremely painful reading accounts of that, because there was one informer who turned state's evidence, but there was felt to be no corroborating evidence. But years later, there was a commission of inquiry. It had happened years later and then been suppressed, and then it was made public. And it's painful reading because there was further evidence from other people who were never called as witnesses. And in fact, it's still somewhat a mystery to me as to why there wasn't an attempt to go all out and implicate Savarkar as well. Because he certainly expected, because he said that he would keep away, and he'd done this before under the British, that he wouldn't be involved with politics, that he would live quietly, and so on. He'd made these deals many times before when he'd been arrested on other occasions. And it's quite likely that he expected to be convicted this time around, but he wasn't. And he lived to many years later. And today, in many shakas, it's the groups, the RSS groups that are active here. There are students are taught, young men who come to these things, teach the children about this killing. And so that we have transcripts of a teacher talking to the children about the killing of Gandhi and playing Mark Tully, a famous BBC reporter, saying a Hindu fanatic killed Gandhi. And the children are taught that they mustn't say Hindu fanatic. This is wrong because it implicates all Hindus. You know, there's a sense that there's a sense of persecution that Hindus are being implicated in the killing of Gandhi. And he lists, the teacher lists numerous assassins, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, etc., and says they were not deemed to be by Christian fanatics. And he says if someone comes to the RSS, doesn't mean the RSS preaches to kill somebody. I tell this to lots of journalists. And he says 3 commissions have all been put out by the government of India to find out if the RSS was involved. All have exonerated the RSS. And do we preach in RSS and HSS to kill for somebody's views? The class in unison says, no, we don't. And so he says that must be our argument. When anybody says RSS killed and you find anyone blaming for Gandhi's assassination, you must put your protest. But at the same time, then the boys ask, well, then who did kill Gandhi and why? And he says, well, Gandhi, you know, betrayed India, and that's why, of course, he's our leader, and we don't say anything. But, so there's a strong doublethink going on. You know, there's a sense that we're being persecuted if it's being named that the RSS wasn't involved. That's not true, because the RSS was banned for a year. They were found to be involved. They were banned, and so on. And he also, in the course of these discussions, was asked whether the RSS and HSS had helped in Modi's elections, and the teacher answers, they did. Every Swayamsevak, that's every volunteer, had to go into town, make sure they speak to people to make sure that they do help Modi in the election. This was done secretly. But when this evidence, and there have been several attempts over the years to put evidence before the Charity Commission. There were attempts after 2002, the Gujarat massacre, which showed that apparently independent charities were actually, one called Seva was actually sharing charity numbers with Hindutva organizations, and that was involved with charitable work in a way that was actually promoting Hindutva messages and excluding people that they didn't like and so on. So there was a complaint made at that time. At that time, the Charity Commission said we couldn't demonstrate that, you know, the shopkeeper collecting money in his collecting box, that money actually went for buying, the swords and the daggers that actually killed people. We couldn't prove that indivisible link from the collecting box in Britain to the killings in India, and therefore nothing could be done. In other words, if you couldn't prove things to the level of criminal responsibility, the Charity Commission wouldn't act. And then in this case, when years later you have this discussion filmed about how, you know, whether the RSS and HSS are one thing, which is really not very controversial. I mean, you know, Wikipedia says so, and they will say that themselves, as they told the children. On that instance, he was actually telling the truth, along a lot of other half-truths and direct lies. But the Charity Commission said there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate, this is in 2015, so not that long ago, to demonstrate that the views expressed by the speaker were endemic or systematic in the charity and its activities. The charity found no other evidence of formal links between the charity and RSS. The Commission considered the implications for the charity if it was associated with RSS, included whether the trustees were in fact furthering the charitable purposes and could be acting in the charity's interest, etc., etc. And it said the trustees assured the Charity Commission that there were no formal links between the two organizations, that there was only an ideological commonality, and this then was not considered further during the inquiry. So even when you have a direct admission of links, they just have to say no, we're not linked, and there you go. It's put aside. And this, by the way, happens with the Muslim groups as well. So I don't want anybody to get away with the idea that because a lot of the discourse around this is one set of people pointing fingers at the other set of people. But what we find is, only very recently, Khatme-e-Nabuwat, a very violent organization promoting blasphemy laws in Pakistan and in other countries, and attacking Ahmadiyyas and other people they consider apostates, has been welcomed by the mayor, by the police, stood on platforms with senior people here in Manchester. So it's something that is happening with Muslim groups as well as with Hindu groups, where whether it's Labour or whether it's the Conservatives, the management of minorities is seen as being done through communal and fundamentalist organizations. And this is so insane, but it continues. And although most of the public discourse is around Labour and its links with extremism, we've been hearing during the anti-Semitism debate, and those links are certainly there, but they're not the only ones. Because although you won't find Tory ministers necessarily hanging out with senior Muslim Brotherhood people, they have issued statements which quietly welcomed Muslim Brotherhood leaders to Britain as refugees after they were overthrown in Egypt. This is at a time when they're actually stopping people fleeing regimes like that from coming to this country, stopping Christian archbishops from coming to this country lest they claim asylum from Syria and Iraq. And the Home Office has quietly supported the Muslim Brotherhood, also supported charitable funding. It gave money to an umbrella charity, which was actually Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami, which is an Indian organization, in fact, an Indian organization of political Islam that was founded in India about 20 years after the Hindutva movement was founded. So this is a problem that we face if we're challenging fundamentalism, is that the local states, as well as the national government, is absolutely embedded with these groups. And one of the examples of that for the Tories is Priti Patel, who is a right-wing Brexiteer, seen as an up-and-coming young minister until she went off message and made trips to Israel in her own time, but made sort of government-to-government contacts and had strong right-wing links with the Israeli right-wing groups, and as well as having very strong links with Hindutva groups, and she, of course, was in the cabinet. One of the confusing things, or that some people might find confusing, is that although the BJP and the RSS and the VHP have a profoundly conservative view of women's role in society, they've also had a lot of women leaders, and very aggressive women leaders, and now in the cabinet there are many women. But although the government didn't oppose the recent Supreme Court judgment that decriminalized homosexuality, they stayed away, but you find now in the days afterwards, there are waves and waves of condemnation coming from the Hindu right. I don't know if the Christians have spoken, but they were some of the main groups that actually took the case to court earlier to get, when it was earlier decriminalized, to have it reversed. And the Muslim groups have come out and condemned the thing. So they're all, the religious leaders are all at one, even though the government has, for the moment, backed off as the government. And one of the things that became a central plank of the BJP's political strategy was to demand a uniform civil code, that is, a uniform common law, which is something that you think that all secularists should support. And in fact, many do, but when the BJP demanded it, it became something that was very difficult to negotiate with women's groups about. Why? Because their version of law may have been a Hindu majoritarian law, because they tended to have a discourse about Muslims having special laws and special rights. But of course, it's not just Muslims who have Muslim law, personal law. Everybody's governed by religious law in India. So Hindus are governed by various forms of Hindu law, Muslims by Muslim law, Christians, and so on, by other laws. And so there emerged a huge debate in India about what to do and how to position oneself in this. And whereas a very few feminists still argued for some form of uniform code, in conditions where it was impossible to negotiate what they called a they preferred to call it a gender-just code rather than a uniformity, not to stress uniformity, but to stress justice. And it was found very difficult to negotiate. And so most of the strategies have been about reforming the personal laws individually, so that property rights have been granted to Hindu women through various law reforms. Divorce came in the early period after independence. The great Dalit leader, Ambedkar, who had formed, who was a great constitutional lawyer and sat in the Constituent Assembly, had argued very strongly for a uniform code and said, why do we have our independence if we can't challenge religion and challenge caste and challenge these caste distinctions? And those arguments had been in the end what happened was it was put in a sort of as a general principle in the directive principles of the Constitution, but it wasn't instituted at the time. So there's a sort of a little bit of a double think about it. But what happened was that before he was killed, Gandhi had actually made sure, just before independence, that India should take its place, in fact go at the founding of the UN, before India was even independence. He wanted my grandmother there, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, to represent India at the UN. And she was actually, later she became president of the UN, but at that time she was a complete outlier. She was sort of camping out, you know, in the lobby of a hotel. She was supported by Indian activists. She was supported by a grand coalition of an anti-racist movement, the National Association of Colored People, W.E. Du Bois, Walter White, the American Civil Liberties Association, and so on, all of whom had converged on San Francisco at the founding conference of the UN because they knew that they needed some other law, more than national law. They needed a framework of rights in order to be able to govern a post-war world. That it wasn't just to be a settlement between the great powers, but it was to be to do with the individual rights of human beings. And my grandmother, again, even before India became independent, then went to the General Assembly after it was formed and brought the case of South Africa. So one of the first times when a government was interfering in the sovereign affairs of another government, because all through the Nazi murders, there was actually no settled law that could interfere with the legal actions of one state to its own citizens, even if when they declared them complete non-citizens. So she argued that as part of an anti-racist front. And in fact, indeed, here in Manchester in 1945, there was a Pan-African Congress meeting in which many of the leaders who later became national leaders in South Africa, in Africa, in various parts of Africa, came. There were ex-servicemen who were here and so on, who were arguing for equality and against empire and so on. So that was one person. The other was Hansa Mehta, who sat on the drafting committee of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she brought with her a charter that had already been developed by the women's movement in India of rights and responsibilities, which was an incredibly radical document. I mean, this had been developed during the 1930s. India at that time didn't have full adult suffrage. It did have a form of suffrage, but it was a property directorate. And women did vote, but it was full equality for women, a uniform civil code, protections for labor, etc., co-education, the abolition of the stigma of illegitimacy, free and full consent in marriage, which must be monogamous. And we're still fighting for those things. These have not yet been won. But one of the key achievements that she had many achievements, including the first sentence, all human beings are equal in dignity and rights. So she said if you say all men, women will not be read into it automatically. You have to say human beings. So that was one of her, where she negotiated with Eleanor Roosevelt and others. But there's a clause on marriage, and that's free and full consent in marriage. And that clause, which I think subsequent generations of feminists did not understand how radical it was. It was not part, there were many people who contributed to the drafting of the Universal Declaration. There wasn't one mind behind it. But it was not part of a classic civil liberties discourse drawn from French rights or anything. It was in fact considered by Eleanor Roosevelt quite vulgar to talk about something like marriage. I mean, people understood Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, they understood freedom of speech, they understood freedom of religion, and various things like that, protection for religion. They did not understand why marriage should be there. And of course, this clause was immediately, it was condemned by American anthropologists who hate any kind of advance. It was condemned by the American Bar Association because it broke segregation laws in America, because it allowed interracial marriage. It broke, it was of course condemned by the South Africans, it was condemned by the Saudis, who didn't vote for the Universal Declaration. But it got through. And it got through as a law which allowed marriage of choice. It allowed people to marry outside their community. So it allowed interracial marriage. The implications were that it allowed intercaste marriage, which was one of the big dividing issues. Gandhi and Ambedkar had many debates about this, and Ambedkar persuaded Gandhi that interfaith, intercaste marriages were particularly important, and apparently Gandhi said that he would support that, and so on. So that was the background with which not only was the Indian constitution formed. There were 15 women who sat in the Constituent Assembly, and young women now say, why only 15? But this was, I think, the first Constituent Assembly in which any women sat. They came from all religious backgrounds, from caste backgrounds, Dalit women, and so on, and they contributed to building the constitution. And that's why in the fight against Hindutva, there is such a strong sense of ownership of the constitution. So you have left-wing students, and you really can't imagine this in Britain, standing with posters saying, we will defend our constitution, we want our constitutional rights, so pledging to defend the constitution, and so on. And that, of course, relates to what was going on in the courts in India to undermine what secular law there was, because there is one civil marriage law, which is called the Special Marriage Act, and it's an old 19th century law, but it is the law which allows people to marry across interfaith lines. It's been undermined in Pakistan and Bangladesh. It has the same law. I'm not sure it exists in Pakistan anymore, but in Bangladesh you have to renounce your religion if you marry somebody of another religion, which is of course quite a dangerous thing to do. People may not want to do it. But even though this law exists, there were groups of people, there were cells as they're called, so sort of VHP or RSS people in the courts, because you have to put up notices about this law. I mean, if you're planning to marry under that law, you can't just rock up and get married. You have to put up a notice. These notices are monitored, so it's dangerous for interfaith couples, particularly couples who are running away from their family, to marry in order to do that. And so you find instances where women go to court, or they get persuaded, they get told stories about the man that they're intending to marry. Oh, he's already married, he has several other wives, didn't you know? Their parents are contacted. You have magistrates making it mandatory to solemnize interreligious marriages only with the prior permission of district collectors, which is not the law at all. So there has been an undermining attack on marriage. There has been a physical attack. So a woman, my namesake Gita was killed for having had an interfaith marriage. And there's a man called Babu Bajrangi, who was a BJP, he was a strong man who recovered many Hindu women who married Muslim men or men from other regions or castes. And with the help of the lower judiciary, kidnapped these women and forced them to divorce their husbands and arrange their marriages to Hindu men. So the courts have been an arena of struggle. There is the secular law. People do take recourse to it, but in positions of danger. And meanwhile, there's a discourse about Muslim women that they must only solve these problems within their community. That is often from the liberals and the secularists, saying to Muslim women that the pluralism of laws is actually part of the fabric of Indian tolerance. And Muslim law in India has remained unreformed, so it's much, much more backward than law in Pakistan and Bangladesh, because they had reforms of Muslim law, whereas Hindu law in those countries has remained utterly unreformed and not at all protective. So you have the situation where you had a case where various Muslim women's organizations took a case against what's called triple talaq, that is the sort of repudiation divorce, to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. But then the measures the government brought in were not so much protective of women as criminalizing the men. So it was about taking a stand that in the end didn't help. So the women who'd actually taken that case then, argued against the government's measures. But what's really frightening from the point of view of looking at this in Britain is that Indian Muslim law the most backward, as I said, of the subcontinent, is often used in the informal Sharia courts in this country. Because their purpose, of course, is to roll back any kind of law reform that's happened in other parts of the world of Muslim law and to use the worst forms. And that many Indian liberals don't understand this and actually don't understand the links between what's happening there and what's happening here. And yet we hear Muslim feminists say exactly what we're saying that's happening in this country, is that women are being pushed into these alternative forums as alternative dispute resolution and so on. They're being kept out of the courts, not being able to recourse their rights in the courts. So it's a complicated situation which the women's movement has tried to negotiate through, as I said, through individual law reform, but it hasn't really solved this problem. Now, as well as the issue of marriage, the issue of protection of the cow, which leads to lynching of people who are thought to be dealing in cattle illegally or eating beef and so on, there has been a major attack on, not just on freedom of expression and on writers and rationalists, but on the scientific temper itself. And I think the best commentator we can think of is actually a Pakistani freethinker and friend, Parvez Hudboy, who's been involved with various campaigns against nuclear armament in Pakistan and many other things. And he said, he talks about how Nehru as the first prime minister who insisted on this scientific temper and being put that in the constitution, again, highly unusually. And Hudboy says, if this hadn't happened, instead of being noted for its exceptional space program and brilliant string theorists, India would have become a garbage dump for every kind of crackpot science. Medical research would have concentrated on medicines made from cow urine and cow dung. The celibacy of peacocks would be under intense scrutiny. Astrology would, because somebody said peacocks fertilized by their tears. Astrology would be taught in place of astronomy, and instead of teaching actual mathematics, there would be Vedic mathematics. As in Pakistan, Darwinian evolution would be considered heretical and destructive of religious faith. And in Indian academia, or academics of Indian origin abroad also has its own versions of these arguments. And particularly in an area of study called science studies, an academic called Meera Nanda has argued that the academic left has no resources to deal with the religious right and anti-science views because it's become so relativist in its own thinking. And this has meant that science studies has lent itself to the promotion of Hindutva views on science, which are distinct from but allied to other anti-science theories from Christian and Muslim fundamentalists. In other words, while Euro-American and Indian academics can recognize populism, fascism, and far-right movements as a threat when they come from the majority, their answer is to embrace the same ideas when they're classified as the other. If universalism is rejected as a principle, then the only means of determining where you stand is either to stand with your tribe or to stand with the tribes of the other. And in the course of all that, this attack on the scientific temper, we come back to one of the central theories that pins Hindutva in place. Because if it's a land of blood and soil, the land of the territory and the land of the people in it, and if those people are Aryan, then they have to be the original inhabitants of India, the people known as the Aryans. And Golwalkar, as I said, one of the early ideologues, said, "Out of the heap of hypotheses, we reject all and positively maintain that we Hindus came into this land from nowhere, but are indigenous children of the soil always, from time immemorial, and natural masters of the country. Here we compiled our inimitable Vedas, reasoned out our philosophy of the absolute, the last word on the subject, built our sciences and arts and crafts. Here we progressed in cultivation, industries, and trade, flourished and prospered, a great nation of a great race, propounded the one religion which is no make-believe, but religion in essence." And therefore, all scientific studies in archaeology, linguistics, and so on have to be manipulated in order to show that the Aryans came first. And there was actually a huge urban civilization in India, which more and more sites of which are being discovered, very, very advanced urban civilization. Two major sites are now in Pakistan, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. But there have been excavations done on modern day India's soil as well. But it becomes a problem as to what to do with these excavations, because scientific methods of finding DNA from very ancient corpses thousands of years old, skeletons thousands of years old, have been found. There recently, according to India Today, a report revealed details of a history committee convened by the Office of the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Its task, according to the committee, was to present a report that will help the government rewrite certain aspects of ancient history. The minutes of the meeting apparently set out its aims to use evidence such as archaeological finds and DNA to prove that today's Hindus are directly descended from the land's first inhabitants many thousands of years ago, and make the case that ancient Hindu scriptures are in fact not myth. And the problem is, of course, that the DNA evidence shows that the people buried there are not related to Aryans that are thought by linguistics and other material to have come out of Central Asia and the steppes and gone westwards through Europe and come eastwards into India. And of course, we share common language, family of languages called Indo-European languages. But they're not the original inhabitants, according to this, and there were earlier inhabitants, and that's so far what the DNA shows. But it threatened a collaboration with Harvard. There were problems about how to bring this out, because how do you say it? So Hindutva continues to have promoters, and I mean there are academics, and they're not all Indian academics, and there are a lot of European academics sitting in various universities in America and Belgium and so on, who promote some of these views. But others are part of conspiracies and cults. And I just want to tell the story of a woman called Savitri Devi, who actually happened to be the aunt of a friend of mine called Shumanto Banerjee, who's an Indian writer of the left. He had also been an urban Naxal. He actually was a Naxal, not just called one, but he abandoned that. He actually wrote about Naxalism and very critically about the left later. But anyway, he had an aunt who was born to a Greek father, an English mother, who married an Indian and became known as Savitri Devi. And a writer called Maria Maragoni did a brilliant, and I think you can still hear it on BBC iPlayer, a radio documentary about her. So she became a passionate fascist. And having traveled to India, she learned Indian languages, married a Brahmin whom she believed to be an Aryan like herself, and forged an elaborate synthesis of Nazism and Hindu myth in which Hitler was a man against time and destined to bring about the end of the Kal Yuga, the Dark Ages, and usher in a golden age of Aryan supremacy. In her time, she was venerated by the Hindu right and by European and American Nazis. Today, she is being rediscovered by Golden Dawn and the alt-right. And Maria Maragonis writes, it isn't hard to find discussions of her book on neo-Nazi web forums, especially The Lightning and Sun, which expounds the theory that Hitler was an avatar, an incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu, and Gold in the Furnace, which urges true believers to trust that National Socialism will rise again. The American extreme right website Countercurrent hosts an extensive online archive of her life and work. And her views are reaching a wider public through alt-right leaders such as Richard Spencer, Steve Bannon, former Trump strategist and chair of Breitbart, who've taken up the account of history as a cyclical battle between good and evil, a theory she shared with other 20th century mystical fascists. Now, there's much that I've left out, including the writers' movement that objected to the killing of the rationalists and the lynchings by returning their awards, scientists who returned their awards, actual classic terrorism where Hindu groups decided that they would answer Muslim terrorism bomb for bomb, as they said, blast for blast, and put bombs in shrines, in trains, and so on. But one of the things that I want to say about this growing movement is that some of the most frightening things it's doing, it's not doing out of strength, it's doing out of weakness. It is not very popular at the moment, and that is what's making it particularly dangerous. That is why there are these deflections, there are these very obvious stitch-ups going on. I mean, more obvious than normal. Because the government has failed in what it set out to do, came to power not on a Hindutva platform. I mean, that was the rumbling underneath, but it came to power promising development, promising money in people's pockets, promising jobs, and it's failed to do that. And just as these police raids that I started with were being carried out, there'd been a major report from the Reserve Bank saying that one of its flagship policies, which is to withdraw certain currency notes, called demonetization, had actually caused a huge dip in the economy's growth. So anybody who thinks that the killing of some Muslims or Christians or others is worth it for a growing economy, they need to think again, because actually it hasn't succeeded in its own aims. And it's also, I think, relevant to say that many of the issues that it has fought are partly against the Muslim as the other, but also about drawing in Dalit movements, Dalit groups, because Dalits and Adivasis, they have heavily proselytized over and have drawn some in, but there has been a war for the hearts and minds of Dalit and Adivasi groups, and there is a war going on with corporate interests, and I don't mean the war of the Marxist-Leninist groups, the Maoists, what are called the Naxals, which I think are utterly dangerous and run protection rackets, as well as murdering people and killing policemen and so on. They run protection rackets and so on in the areas they are, and they, I certainly don't share any sense of commonality with them. But there is a vast range of other groups of rationalists, leftists, liberal, etc., who do see the Indian Constitution as their main protection and who do organize movements around it. And even the foundation of the Arya Samaj in the 19th century, with its concern about population, about conversions, about drawing people back into the fold, is still being echoed today. And the foundation of the Hindutva movement in Maharashtra, where there aren't very many Muslims actually, and there weren't the kind of communal violence that was going on in North India at that time, is quite significant. That some historians have said that there were rationalist movements that were very active in Maharashtra at that time. There had been 19th century social reform rationalist movements, and there had been also Ambedkar organizing and mobilizing. And the people who were killed were also not just writers, but organizers and mobilizers who worked across villages. And in many places, Dabolkar, the first who was killed, was a Maharashtrian activist. In the wake of his death, an anti-superstition law was finally passed that he'd been campaigning for in recognition of his work. So there has always been this back and forth about in what ways you include the most marginalized, in what ways you make them part of the self. Are they there because they have constitutional rights as individual citizens, because they have a right not to have atrocities committed against them? Or they part of the Hindu fold where they become, or the Hindutva fold where they become part of the foot soldiers of atrocities against others, which unfortunately has happened. And that's why the secularism of Indians, like the secularism of Bradlaugh, is one that is founded not only in issues about free speech or the individual conscience, although all those things matter. It's founded in an absolute commitment to dealing with the issues of the most marginalized and the most oppressed. Thank you.
You mentioned briefly efforts in the UK to bring caste discrimination within the remit of the Equality Act, something that we've been campaigning for, to ensure that Dalits have some sort of legal protection against this form of prejudice, which is very real. Research has shown that caste discrimination is happening in the UK. I just wonder if you could say a word about the... we've recently found out the government don't intend to provide that level of protection that we think is necessary. They're not going to amend the Equality Act to bring caste as a protected characteristic. What role do you think Hindu nationalists have had in that decision in the UK?
I think they've had a crucial role because they have a lot of meetings with government, they're close to government. I mean, as I said, there's cross-party support, so the Labour Party is also vying for this support. Not, as it happens, Corbyn has clean hands on this one. He's been actually quite protective of Dalit rights. He's chaired the Dalit Solidarity campaign, I think, for years. But other members of the Labour Party are embedded with them, and definitely they are very close to the Tories. They have many meetings. The Hindu Forum has had many meetings over the years. When the only time they've come across as somewhat extremist in Britain, not the only time, but one of the times is around these issues, where I went, for instance, to an all faiths network. It was a new network designed to bring moderates together, because there's so many extremists basically in interfaith groups. I mean, there's certainly many Muslim extremists in interfaith groups. So there was a wonderful speech from a very progressive Muslim imam, for instance. But then a Hindu spokesman got up to speak, and he started talking. At first I really didn't know what he was talking about, because he was talking about cultural genocide. And I didn't know what he was talking about. I couldn't understand it. But he was talking about the caste discrimination issue. And he was talking about the bishops who had supported protections on caste. So he was basically against this sort of what he saw as a Christian lobby that was going after the Hindus. And the issue of cultural genocide was about the right to choice in marriage. I think it was about, if you have this protection for Dalits, then they can come and marry our daughters. And what will happen then? I mean, this will be destroyed. So this whole issue of population and Hindus dying out because they get converted to other religions, or they drift off in ways they're not, contained. So that's one set of things which they talked about. But the closeness to government is absolutely there. And I think the Tories have been really pusillanimous about this, because they talk tough on extremism, but this is an extremism that they absolutely see as allies. And it is so cynical and self-defeating.
It's funny, we actually lodged a Freedom of Information request with the government to find out what meetings they had with Hindu organisations in the build-up to the decision not to legislate against caste. There were no meetings, apparently. So... I'm not sure where they are meeting, but...
There's an academic called Edward Anderson who looked at the whole issue of M.F. Hussain, who was hounded out of India. He's an Indian Muslim artist by his name, and there were so many cases against him. I mean, there isn't an official blasphemy law in India, but there are old offence laws which are very similar. And he was like, there were so many cases against him that he actually had to leave India and go and live in the Middle East, which is not exactly a bastion of freedom either, but he was safer there. And when his paintings were shown here at Asia House, they were vandalized. And that's one of the times when this Hindu Forum became prominent, because it was advocating against Hussain for painting naked goddesses, which are absolutely central to Hindu traditions. And he said that they had many meetings with government at that time.
Yeah.
So
Sure they have. Right. Gentleman there with blue blazer.
Sorry, I'm Dr. Pankaj Mishra, I'm a surgeon. I just had a few questions. I will need some guidance from you, because I'm a very spiritual person. I work as a surgeon. I qualified from India, then I came here because I thought it's a free and fair country. I think I will need some guidance, because I believe in Hindutva. Say if Sita has been addressed as sexy Sita several times in the last 10 years when Congress was in government.
Sita, for the rest of the audience, is taken as goddess Sita, Ma Sita. I don't like her to be addressed as sexy Sita. The book Ramayana, what you were referring, there was a version of Ramayana called Ramanuj Ramayana, introduced in 2011-12 in JNU University. And the book teaches the Hindus that the Ram used to leave Lakshman and Sita alone because they were having extramarital affair. That hurt me, and obviously I'm a spiritual person. I don't think that is right. Lawyers went to the court, and finally Monica Arora was the lawyer who led the group of lawyers, and finally this university course was withdrawn from JNU because that was absolutely blasphemous to the Hindus. If you write something like this for any other religion, that Sita and Lakshman were having an extramarital affair, I can tell you, you will be beheaded if you write anything about it, any other religion like that. That is my second question. My third question is, the slide behind you says Hansa Mehta was supporting uniform civil code. The BJP, the RSS, the VHP, whom we have criticized so much, they are supporting uniform civil code, gentlemen. If Hansa Mehta was alive today, she would have been supporting BJP because they are fighting for uniform civil code for last, what, 60 years, 70 years, and they are opposing it. And when we talk about minorities, please talk, I'm a Pandit. 5 million Kashmiri Pandits have been butchered in Kashmir. No one talks about them. I graduated from AIMS Delhi, which is a very prestigious institution. I have dealt with my own colleagues, junior doctors, who came showing me the letter. They had letters dropped through their post box saying either convert or leave this city. And if you are leaving the city, please leave your women folk behind. And there are 5 million Kashmiri Pandits who are my brothers. They have been butchered in Kashmir. No one talks about it. There are 5,006 butchered in Delhi alone in 1984. When you talk about minorities, Sikhs are in minority, Christians are in minority in India, Buddhists are in minority, Jains are in minority. Why don't we talk about them? No one wants to talk about. If this room is full of tolerant people, give me 5 minutes. I haven't met any speech or any slide. I haven't read anything. I'm a heart surgeon. I do my job. I was on emergency call yesterday. But I can stand there and tell you, please believe in Hindutva. Hindutva is a way of life. It's not a fight going between, I'm not a Congress person or a BJP person or an RSS person. I'm a spiritual person. I believe, ma'am, you will know, Janmashtami was a few days back, yeah? And I celebrated Janmashtami. Suppose on the day of Janmashtami, you come or anybody else comes and tells me that, look, if you believe in Krishna, start saying, Bhishma Pitama Murdabad, Dronacharya Murdabad. If anybody who has read Mahabharata will know that Krishna was the person who instigated Arjun to kill Bhishma Pitama and kill Dronacharya.
Okay, excuse me, I think your point out of order.
Okay,
please sit down.
Can we have an answer?
Okay, thanks. Let's get to respond.
Well, I regret that there are a lot of things I had to drop that I wanted to say. And on the issue of the Kashmiri Pandits, it is a huge stain on the conscience of India and the conscience of the human rights communities, both in India and abroad. Because you're absolutely right. The things that happened to Kashmiri Pandits were exactly what was happening, similar to the things that I described in other atrocities that have happened. And yet,
can you tell us what a Kashmiri
oh, sorry. The Hindu Kashmir is a majority Muslim state.
Yes.
I mean, there are Buddhists and there are other people living there, but there were Hindus were called Pandits over there. That was their caste background, and they were driven out in the 90s during the course of a Pakistan-backed insurgency. I mean, there has been a lot of violence in Kashmir. The army is violent against, some of the citizens of Kashmir. I don't want to defend everything that the army does in Kashmir, but on the other hand, what is very difficult for people in the civil liberties movement to acknowledge is that there has been what is clearly a foreign-backed insurgency. I mean, the evidence is absolutely clear. And as the gentleman said, Kashmiris were driven out. I mean, I have acquaintances and relatives and friends who were driven out of Kashmir during the 1990s largely, and who became internal refugees, displaced people internally. This was an issue that was taken up as a BJP issue, and it became a central, one of their central issues, and was therefore not taken up, which was wrong, by other organizations. So for instance, when Amnesty or Human Rights Watch or whatever, they've done reports on state violations in Kashmir, of which there are, but they haven't really examined the cross-border violations. They haven't examined what happened to people who were murdered, coerced, driven out. So I absolutely agree that was a horror, and it is one. On the Uniform Civil Code, I tried to indicate that this is something that is in the Constitution as an idea and has never been implemented, and that the BJP did take it up, and that made it difficult actually for feminists to take it up, because they didn't know whether, because you see what Hansa Mehta wanted was a whole lot of other things that go with the uniform, not just something uniform, but something that gives women a lot of rights. And even now, where, in fact, even within the BJP, Maneka Gandhi wants to develop she's a minister in the government, she wants to develop what's called a prenuptial agreement, to give, women rights in marriage. And a lot of the orthodox people are saying, no, we don't want that because, it undermines Kanyadan, it undermines the sacramental nature of the Hindu ceremony. So there's an argument inside that. So I did try and indicate some of that in the talk. What you're saying about hurt feelings, I think speaks to absolutely centrally the issue of whether people's hurt feelings ought to stop discussions or challenges to religion. Now, the BJP now claims the figure of Ambedkar as somebody that they embrace, that he was a great Dalit leader. They say they respect him, and they've actually, put garlands on his statues and so on. But Ambedkar burnt the Manusmriti. Yeah, he burnt the book of Hindu law, which is a sacred text of Hindu law. And he talked about the annihilation of caste, and he was anti-Hindu in a very profound way. I mean, he led his people into, he said, I don't want to die a Hindu and untouchable. So he led them into converting to Buddhism. That was one of his solutions. So I think, I understand that your feelings may be hurt. The Ramanujan case, I mean, to my shame, I haven't read Ramanujan myself, so I don't know exactly what, there are a lot of allegations made about things. So having not read, I don't know if the allegations you're making are true. I think it wasn't JNU, it was Delhi University. JNU has become a focus because it's a known left-wing university, and the students there have been attacked. There have been fake videos distributed about them. In fact, precisely on the Kashmir issue, there was a young man only a few days ago who was shot at in the center of Delhi. And this young man is called Umar Khalid. He is by background a Kashmiri Muslim, but he is an atheist and a leftist and a student leader. And so he's like a walking trigger warning. And actually, right in the heart of a security area, somebody tried to kill him. That's pretty serious. I mean, the MPs there, there's, heavy security around there, and these killers got away. Somebody's been arrested for that now. Then they put up a video saying that they thought it would be an Independence Day gift to the nation. So the students of JNU have been demonized because they were what was shown later to be faked videos on TV showing that they were shouting Azadi, which is freedom, and it's a slogan that Kashmiri separatists shout. So they were made out to be Kashmiri separatists, but actually they were shouting anti-patriarchal feminist slogans, freedom from caste, freedom from violence, freedom from this, that, and the other. I mean, feminist friends of mine invented those slogans. That's what they were shouting. So there's a lot of lies, a lot of misinformation, and I accept that you may be very deeply hurt by some of the things that are said, but Ramanujan was a standard book on a standard text. And the fact that there was this attack on it, as there was on Wendy Doniger, as there have been now on a woman called Audrey Trushka, who's written on Aurangzeb. Now, I may not agree with everything Audrey Trushka says.
He lived his full life. He was never beaten. He was never chased. He lived his full life. He was never chased or haunted. He lived his full life.
But he was not controversial.
Okay, no more questions. We've got to let someone else speak now. Gentleman in the check shirt.
In theory, is the Indian Constitution a secular constitution? Does it have anything in it about individual human rights? And are the courts in India capable of supporting those?
Absolutely. I mean, it has very strong protections for individual human rights. And just recently, we've had the courts standing up for human rights. There's been a major judgment. It's like it's a leading judgment in the world on the decriminalization of homosexuality.
Okay, that's at a very high level. Is that true also at lower level?
They're much more corruptible at lower level. They're much more problematic. But sometimes they do. I mean, there are lawyers who will fight in those courts, and they will continue to fight. And these are the ones who are actually being attacked now. It's people who are the defenders of the lawyers in the local courts who are fighting for the rights of the most marginalized people, for labor groups, for tribal groups, for Dalits, and so on. So it's a broken system, but it's stumbling on. And what there is a consciousness among people which makes them stand up for their rights and makes them feel that the Constitution is theirs, and that they own it, and that they will speak in its name. And that's what I was trying to convey, that Constitution came out of the anti-colonial struggle, because the colonial struggle was not about just getting rid of the invader and the foreigner. It was about saying we have to own, we are responsible for our own oppression. Once the British have gone, we have to solve this oppression and solve the problems of this society. And of course they haven't been solved, but that consciousness is there, and it's what fuels that resistance.
Thank you. Next question. Richard.
Thank you for your fascinating lecture. Can you just say a bit more about the activities of the HSS in the UK? How big are they? What does their activism consist of? Is it money raising, or is it other things? What are they actually doing?
Well, it's a very disciplined organization. So I interviewed a woman who had grown up within one of those organizations. She said that she changed and left, in the late 60s. I mean, but she said that they did a lot of charity work. So I mean, well, they have regular classes and sessions. I mean, maybe later the gentleman can tell us if he goes to them. But they do a lot of charity work. They have their own flag, so they salute the flag. They do certain exercises. They maybe do some yoga. They get taught about Indian history, but as I tried to indicate briefly, in a slightly warped way, and things that actually don't stand up to scrutiny. But they gain a pride of being Hindus living in Britain, and unlike some of the extremist Muslim groups and so on, I mean, they don't dress differently or have any visible markers of difference that way, and so that they're seen as perfectly integrated. In fact, indeed, many of them are doctors, lawyers, and other things. So they're both working class people, and it's a cross-class movement. They're people who are professionals. And so on. But they have been very instrumental in, for instance, organizing a huge jamboree for Modi when he came Prime Minister, when he came to Wembley, which actually Cameron had a walk-on part. I mean, he appeared as the sitting Prime Minister of this country, as the sidekick of a foreign leader, to try and get the Indian vote. So, and Labour MPs were saying they'd give raise in their wages towards this thing. So they do raise money for their own causes, but also for charitable causes outside. But those charitable causes are also about restructuring and reordering what's happening, the villages in India. So, for instance, encouraging conversion. So you get people called Nava Hindus, new Hindus, who may have been Muslims, who've taken on a Hindu name and building a Ram temple in the middle of the village and things like that. So but a lot of these projects just collapse after a while.
Given that they're a registered charity in the UK, do you think they provide any public benefit?
I think they're quite dangerous as a registered charity. I think, I'm not in favor of banning groups and things like that, but I don't see why they're a charity. And I don't see why half the charities that are charities are charities indeed.
Agreed. Gentleman in the blue jumper?
From the organizer, one question, please.
I think you've asked one. Gentleman in the blue jumper.
Got a question about Charity Commission, a few questions. So what kind of an organisation is it? Who is it accountable to? Where does it get its funding from? So when I say what kind of organisation is it like a government quango, or is it under the remit of the Home Office? And what's the role of the Charity Commission and solely at all with regards to the politicians, etc.?
Do you want to answer that, or shall I? Or
Well,
it's a government. It's set up by the government it's the charity regulator for all registered charities in the UK. It's funded by the government. It's underfunded, given the vast number of charities there are. There are big questions about just how effective it can be as a regulator with the funding it has and the vast number of charities that we have. We are actually at the moment preparing a report on charities in the UK and the role of the Charity Commission, so that will be coming out shortly, so look out for that. Any other questions? The lady there in the third row?
A question that puzzles me. I think throughout history and in current days as well, we've seen governments of the day relying on scriptures to justify their political actions. And I think if one looks at Trump's America, relying on ignorance of the scriptures and selectively choosing parts of the scriptures to justify what they're doing. What worries me is that perhaps the Indians are doing the same thing. If one looks at the Rig Veda, it talks about people from the north, the Indo-Europeans conquering the darker-skinned Dravidians. And you talked about the adherence to the scriptures that the Hindutva observe. Isn't there a contradiction there?
There are many contradictions. I mean, you know, where do you start? The thing is that Hinduism itself is full of contradictions and has lived with those contradictions. And I think the genius of Hindutva is that it's taken on some of those. It's sort of internalized some of them. So it allows some of them to grow and develop and become key mobilizing movements, like the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. I mean, there's a court case due soon which may or may not settle that issue. I mean, the parties have said that they'll abide by it. But the Ramanujan case that was mentioned earlier, I mean, there are numerous versions of the Ramayana, and in fact there have been exhibitions attacked which showed these different versions. Some of them had been written by early RSS writers. So there are parts of India where, or Sri Lanka, where Ram and Sita are seen as brother and sister. Now, I mean, the dominant version that we all grew up with, obviously Sita was Ram's wife and his faithful and devoted wife, you know, throughout her life.
There's only one authentic version, Valmiki Ramayana.
But that's the point, you see, that you're saying there's one authentic version, but there are many versions of this story, and different groups in India have lived and worshipped according to different versions of the story. And for me, I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I have most of my relatives are, some of my relatives are very religious, some not. But the act of being Hindu was to be able to live with whichever stories you want and to worship how you want. And in fact, we don't see ourselves in that way of monotheistic religions, that you have one central text and one central place that's the Holy Land and one central way of worshipping. I would say that that's not very Hindu, you know, because it is so diverse in its practice.
Okay, we've got time for about 2 more questions. I'll take the woman on the back row there, and then the gentleman in the green shirt there.
Hi, I just wanted to ask your opinion, Gita. Do you think that, in this case, Hindu fundamentalism was the primary factor behind the anti-Sikh riots of 1984?
No. In a word, it was organized by the Congress. Indira Gandhi had been murdered by her Sikh bodyguards, and Congress leaders and activists, in very similar ways to what later happened in Gujarat, they got hold of petrol, they got hold of rations and so on, and they in a very systematic way went out to largely poor Sikh neighborhoods and massacred people and raped them and burnt them. And so there are some allegations that the RSS may have been involved as well, but actually the primary responsibility has to be with the Congress Party, and it was a horrific set of massacres for which there still is no justice and accountability. On that, I think, I mean, this was raised by this gentleman, and other people have said, you know, why are you talking about 2002? What about 1984? on that particular issue, the civil liberties community has very clean hands in the sense that, one, they mobilized, I mean, a lot of my friends mobilized, worked in the refugee camps and so on. They also organized investigations. They named the guilty parties. They named MPs and other Congress leaders who were involved and had been, witnesses had seen them and so on. So there's a mountain of evidence around this. And it really was, I mean, every party is capable of committing atrocities and doing it for political gain. And that's what happened.
So 2 questions. Firstly, how strong is the BJP in southern India, given the conversation that we've had about belief in India areas? And secondly, has there been any attempt to attack the teaching of evolution in schools?
That's a good one, because there have been a lot of changes to the textbooks. I mean, Hitler has been hugely popularized, which is why it's quite remarkable that the links with the Jewish right in Israel are very, very strong, because this is a party that openly supports Nazism. I think that the issue of, I mean, the key issue for the BJP is not so much creation theory in the Christian sense. Its creation theory is about the Aryans, which is why I talked about that. And I think, there is an attempt to teach that. In the South, you're right, it has been largely a northern party, but it's spreading to other areas through alliances. So there are key southern parties which had their origins in anti-Brahmanical movements, and in fact are quite atheist and anti-northern and anti-many things, but some of them have been in alliance with the BJP. But they also have made alliances in some of the eastern states, which are now Christian majority states, where wouldn't have thought that they would have made much headway, but they have, I think, become very much more a national party than they were before.
Thank you. Right, drinks await. But before we wrap up, I've just got a few announcements to make about some upcoming events of the NSS. Tomorrow, the NSS Roadshow rolls on to Leicester. There'll be a historical talk at Leicester Secular Hall from Bob Forder on Chapman Cohn, who is the longest serving president of the NSS. That talk will be repeated in London on the 13th of September. On the 27th of October, we'll be in Birmingham for a conference on healthcare and secularism. So that will look at some of the issues around the intersection of secularism and healthcare, some very kind of important issues around infant circumcision, conversion therapy, and conscience exemptions. So please do join us in Birmingham for that one if you can. On the 18th of May next year, and this hasn't been released yet, tickets aren't on sale, but they will go on sale next week. But I can announce exclusively today that we'll be having a major international conference in London on religious freedom and its limits, really exploring the concept of religious freedom. We've got a really good lineup of speakers for that, so please do join us. Get your tickets early to avoid disappointment for that conference. That's in May next year. Right, just leaves me to thank Gita again for a very stimulating and informative lecture. Thank you very much. Please do, if you want to speak to myself or any of the campaign team that are here today, or some of our directors, please do join us for drinks outside, where we're happy to take questions. Just please show your appreciation for Gita Sahgal.